Okay, hi everybody. Welcome once again to Right on the Nail. It's lovely to have you with us. We've got so much to talk about. We haven't had a Right on the Nail for almost a month, and during that time, I must say, had we had one, it would have been out of date the next day anyway. And so might this, unfortunately, because things are moving so quickly. But we have a very, very interesting panel to discuss the very, very complicated and interesting situation that we find ourselves in. We are joined today by Communications Director for Progressive International, former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, and author of Our Bloc, How Do We Win? That's James Schneider. It's lovely to have you with us again, James. Also, Labour member of the London Assembly for Merton and Wandsworth since 2016. That's Leonie Cooper. Great to have you back with us, Leonie. And also two other highly important people who are regulars on Right on the Nail from time to time. That is the highly acclaimed writer and journalist and broadcaster Christina Patterson, and the Jean-Monnet Professor of European Integration at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth, John O'Brien. And John is an expert on almost everything and certainly is always worthwhile listening to as well. So we're going to have a fantastic conversation. Where we're going to start is clearly in the UK, clearly with the political situation, and the fact that we have now had 6 different prime ministers in 10 years, and it looks like there's a good chance we're about to have a 7th. Have we been appointing the wrong prime ministers? Have they been doing a bad job? Or is it the case that the country has become basically ungovernable? And if we've become ungovernable, is it the fault of our system, or is it the fault of the new media environment we find ourselves in, both with a maybe right-wing dominated media in terms of print media, new broadcast channels like GB News, which is a right-wing television broadcaster, or is it social media? If anybody took the job of Prime Minister of the United Kingdom now, faced with that environment, are they likely to fail regardless of how good they might be? Or is there someone lurking around who is good and would be able to control things and do the kind of job that we expect to receive from the Prime Minister of our country? Christina.
I think my answer is yes to all of those questions with various weights of emphasis. I think, very sadly, we have got fewer high-quality politicians than we used to have. And that sounds like a very derogatory thing to say. And I honestly don't mean it in a derogatory way. I mean that the job has become extremely difficult, if not impossible. And just looking at the current crop, and a lot of them are highly intelligent people, but I don't think we're seeing the kind of towering intellect that we might have seen. For example, I mean, I wasn't a fan of Margaret Thatcher, but I think no one could deny that she was an extraordinarily intelligent woman and a genuine independent thinker. And I'm not sure, looking at the current cabinet, that I could name anyone who falls into that category of intellect or thinking. But I also think that the climate has changed so radically since Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, but even actually in the last 10 years, because the 24/7 media climate combined with unrelenting streams of social media on everything from TikTok to X to Facebook to all the platforms that are out there, the merciless scrutiny, the expectations of the electorate for instant solutions to everything when there aren't instant solutions, and the geopolitical climate where one crazy inhabitant of the White House can upend the entire global economy by launching airstrikes on a country, and when he's been warned that that will unleash a global economic crisis in the Straits of Hormuz. All of this makes for not just an unstable geopolitical and economic global climate, but one that's almost impossible. And it means that almost any promise you make is impossible to keep. I mean, people are already saying, well, you know, I voted for change and I haven't seen change. Well, obviously, everybody wants change all the time. They want what they want. People want different things. They want essentially Scandinavian welfare services and economic rates of taxation. People want everything. Understandably, people have been stuck since 2008 with very stagnating living standards, very stagnating salaries. And the net result is a mess. So, I mean, I'll leave it at that. But I think it is a very difficult job now. I do, however, think that there are better candidates than Keir Starmer. And I'm hoping that one will emerge from this current turbulence and the events of the next few weeks, because I think the number one job, actually, of a politician now and even of a leader is clear communication. And very sadly, I think Keir Starmer is a pretty decent man, but he lacks that skill.
Well, James, I mean, Tony Blair, he was prime minister for, I'm not sure how long, it was almost 10 years. Some of them will probably tell me it's more. Would Tony Blair survive in this media environment now if he was prime minister, or somebody of his ability? Is there somebody that could survive like a Tony Blair did?
I don't think it's the media system that we should be focusing on. The media system may be more difficult than it was 20, 30 years ago, but I don't think that alone explains why we have such remarkable volatility in our politics. I think for that, we need to look at the underlying economic conditions and the fact that the model of accumulation that was set up under Margaret Thatcher, carried forward by Major, Blair and Brown, utterly fell apart with the 2008 financial crisis. And nobody in the British establishment has a real program for how to get the economy sufficiently on track that the people that own the economy can make good rates of profit while advancing the living standards of at least a narrow majority or a large minority of the population. And that's the fundamental reason why politics are unstable. And I think Tony Blair, who was a very good communicator, or take Barack Obama, a very good communicator, or anybody like that, if you put them in charge of the government today, I think they might be doing 1 or 2 percentage points better because they are better communicators. They're slightly more nimble on their feet. But it's the fundamental program that matters. Look, most people very rationally are not like us and are not following every twist and turn of politics. It's not the soap opera that they are following. What they are noticing is whether their lives are improving or not. So if you are a better communicator about life not getting better, you might be able to slightly improve your condition with the people that are really following things closely. If you want to have a stable government, you need to have or a stable set of institutions. You need to have an order which is improving lives for the majority of people. Now, part of what I'm finding quite depressing about the changes that we are likely to see within the Labour Party and therefore within the government, this is not to say I think Starmer's done a good job. I think he's done a bad job. But we aren't seeing anybody setting out something which will fundamentally alter the underlying conditions, which means that, as Christina was saying, life is getting worse for probably a narrow majority of people and has been doing so for 2 decades. And it's written in our bank balances. It's also written on the bodies of our children. There are certain things that we had assumed for 100 years would just keep on going up. Life expectancy would just keep on going up. The average heights of children would keep on going up. Whatever the struggles were of today, life would be better for children and for one's grandchildren. All of those certainties have come unstuck. And until there is a program that begins to get to grips with those issues, and if you're going to do that, you have to look at the money. And that by look at the money, I don't mean can we shave off $1 billion or $2 billion here or there from the entitlements of people that are, generally speaking, not very well off. In this same period of time of the last 20 years, where life has been getting basically worse or no better for most people, it is not like the economy hasn't grown, and it's not like the wealth of the largest corporations and the richest people hasn't gone up. So unless we begin to engage with those things, politics is going to be volatile and life is going to not feel hopeful and like it's expanding.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of very rich people around, and the rich list was published by the Sunday Times yesterday, but we didn't even need to see that to know. We know that from America and from Trump and all of his friends in America, that are some incredibly wealthy people that, boy, I mean, there's only so much that you need, surely, but a lot of people are going without, and that's what we know. John, I mean, I think both Christina and James are right in what they say. What's the solution to it?
Well, I think they are right, and they've stressed slightly different things. I think Christina's right about the media landscape making things much more difficult, and James is right about the vast increase in inequality, which has been driving these populist movements of the right in the United States and in much of Europe, as well as in Britain. But I think we have to also acknowledge that Labour has made some terrible mistakes. Now, remember, they have only been in office for 12 out of the last 47 years. So the bulk of the policy errors that have led Britain to the precarious point it's at have been made by conservative parties. The one great period of growth that we can identify in those 47 years is between 1997 and 2007. So you would have thought that when Labour came back in the summer of 2024, that they would be absolutely determined to avoid own goals. And almost from the beginning, that's what we saw from them. Whether it was that stupidity of taking freebie tickets for football games or for concerts, tickets, by the way, that are completely inaccessible for the bottom 50% of population because they're so expensive. We then get to the winter fuel payments, and I think that's the issue that has really done for Keir Starmer in the intervening period since that change was made. It sort of marked him as a ditherer, somebody who was malleable, and somebody who didn't really have strong convictions. So I think Labour has to acknowledge that those own goals that they have made have contributed very, very significantly to the point they're at now. They had a whopping majority, at least in terms of seats, when they came in. And now that government looks as fragile as Theresa May's government looked, for example, after she mistakenly went for an election. The problems that the Labour government faced, by the way, they're problems that almost every centrist government faces. Arguably, France is in an even more difficult situation. It has a budget deficit that's ballooned to more than 6% of GDP. There's the real prospect that Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella will win the presidency next year. We have in Germany the Merton government, which has been in office for, I think, an even shorter period than Keir Starmer's, under enormous pressure. The coalition is very fractious. And waiting in the wings, we have the AfD party, the Alternative for Deutschland, which is now, for the first time, heading the polls in Germany over Merz's CDU. I think the answer to these questions, Chris, to directly, after long-winded trying to answer your question, lies in redistribution. I think James is right about this. And one of the things we have to watch, I think, is the kind of experiments that are going on in places like New York. The Mamdani arrival in power, I think, is very interesting and significant. He has already, by the way, managed to cut the budget deficit in New York very significantly, but he has also been willing to tax rich people. And I think that's absolutely key. If you look at all the evidence from the US and from Europe over the last 50 years, the top 5% are doing better than ever before. The top 1% and 0.1% are doing unbelievably well, while the bottom 50% of people have seen their incomes and their lifestyle completely stagnate. So I think you have got to really think about and focus on programs that help to redistribute income and wealth back to the kind of models that we saw in the post-World War II period. We had much more equitable societies. CEOs may have earned 50 times the average workforce salary. They didn't earn 300 and 400 and 500 times those salaries. I think there has to be a reckoning around that. And if there isn't, I think we are in real, real trouble, because we have the Gulf crisis, number one. We have an El Nino climate crisis, which is threatening to exacerbate the lack of fertilizer because of the Gulf crisis. And we could see later in the year, not just the inflation level go up enormously, the unemployment level go up significantly. And all governments, I think, of a centrist disposition are going to face challenges that even 2008 didn't provoke. I think it could be much more serious again than 2008, comparable actually to what happened after 1929.
It might be a good time not to be in government because we're facing such difficult times. And I agree. I mean, that whilst there are so many rich people flaunting their wealth, which they are doing, then it, as I say, it makes it difficult to tell everybody else further down the food ladder that times are tough. That's why you're going to have to take a bit of a bath on everything. The other problem in terms of redistribution of wealth is that, as we can see, the world we live in now, if someone's got a load of money and they don't want to give it to the government in the form of tax, they just jump on a plane and go somewhere else. So how do you have wealth creators, which we need anyway, and at the same time, if the wealth creator has created wealth for themselves and they can afford to pay for everything, and I say to people, I mean, it's, we've got to pay for hospitals and schools and education and transport and police and so forth. And the poor people don't have the money to pay for it, so the other people have got to pay for it. But if all the other people jump on a plane and go and live in Dubai or somewhere, then it's not an easy answer. But let me bring in Leonie. Leonie, where do you think the Labour Party and the Labour government sits in all of this? And let's say you're under pressure from both the reform, I nearly said right wing, I'm not sure if they really are right wing, let's say populist, and at the same time now from a very left wing Green Party. So you're trying to toe a middle line. I think some people are thinking you need to be tackling the Green Party, where other people feel you need to be tackling reform just because immigration is such a big issue. So how do you square that particular peg?
Can I just spiral back a little bit to what you were saying about the number of prime ministers over the last 10 years? Because I actually think that has a lot to do with the situation with Brexit, which was almost exactly 10 years ago, June 2016. And I'm not sure saying that we've had 6 prime ministers in 10 years is necessarily a defining situation of saying, oh, politics is completely broken. And I think to a certain extent, what happened with Cameron spiraling into May, spiraling into Johnson, spiraling into Truss, spiraling into Sunak, is that's interesting that the Tories did that. Also crazy that the Tories did that. In a way, they brought some of it on themselves. But I don't think we should necessarily take that to be something that is now widespread in politics. I think that's a particular period of time and a particular period of conservative, I don't really want to call it insanity, but at the same time, I do want to call it insanity. I mean, it was a ridiculous thing for them to do. But in one sense, it also speaks to the issue that Christina touched on about the quality of people who become prime minister and politicians. And I sit in the London Assembly, and I'll come back to that because obviously I sit with Zach Palansky and I see a lot of him. Kemi Badenoch was a London Assembly member before she went into Parliament, and a number of other Conservative and Labour politicians, but probably the most famous person to be in City Hall was the previous mayor of London. And he's not my politics, obviously, but I think in many ways, Boris Johnson is a really good example of a great communicator who was good at communicating what he was doing as the mayor of London. But when he took on being prime minister, he completely fell apart because he wasn't capable of taking that additional step up, and he just wasn't good enough. And I do think it is being a politician is something that is a skill. It's an art. It's a trade that you have to learn over a large number of years. And this is where I completely agree with Christina about the communication element. Disagree with James, who was saying communications isn't as important. I don't think the Brexit referendum would have gone the way it did if it hadn't had both Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, who are brilliant communicators. Going to repeat again, great communicators, don't agree with them. If they hadn't both been punting for let's leave, and I don't think there was an equivalent of them on the Remain side. So they got what they wanted. If you look at the rise of the Greens now, and you've just said, Chris, and I think quite rightly, having looked at the programme that I believe they're going to be adopting in some of the London boroughs that they're now running, they're not so much green as just radical left. because the environment is not really being mentioned, and that's my lead in
that's
law.
very true.
Why have they suddenly risen? And I think it's because Zach, who is a trained actor, I know everyone goes on about, hypnotist and all that side of, what was it, and the sun's sting on him of this nonsense. Could he enlarge women's breasts and all that stuff? But actually, he's a trained actor. There's a lovely video when he was a Liberal Democrat of him praising Israel to the skies, which is almost exactly the opposite of what he would be saying about Israel now. He's incredibly convincing. We're both on the Environment Committee together. We're both on the Fire Committee. I was the deputy of the Environment Committee when he was the chair. So we work very closely. I like Zach a lot, but his communication skills are what has driven the Greens to be where they are. And if you look at Nigel Farage and the many variants of parties that he's led with multiple names, I won't rehearse them all, but, reform is where it is because he is a brilliant communicator. Now we turn to the government and we look at Labour. And I say to myself, who is the brilliant communicator at the moment in the government? And I would struggle to answer my own question. I think they really do need to step up on communication. But coming back to what is the programme, and I think it's, everyone has touched on what is the programme of Labour. I do think it's quite difficult because going into the last election and just saying change, so everybody has an empty Ming vase, the Ming vase that had to be carried around apparently in the last general election. I didn't quite understand that metaphor. But inside that Ming vase, which has change painted on the outside, everybody has put their own version of change. And I think that's part of the problem for the government is everybody is thinking, well, you haven't done what I wanted you to do, what I wanted to see changed. When you have different politicians, and I'm going to refer to both Sadiq Khan in London, who stood on a specific platform and was roundly shouted out by lots of people who didn't like that platform, or Andy Burnham, who stood on a specific platform, or, Helen Godwin Teague, who stood down in for the mayor down in the West Country. If you're standing on a specific platform that people understand, and then you start delivering it, whether that be, ULEZ or whether that be changes to the health service or bringing in a tram system, people can point at, oh, yes, you said you were going to do that. And then you can say, and now I have delivered it. And I think that's the government's problem, is they need to communicate better, but they also need to have 6 things that they're going to deliver. Tony Blair's pledge card with 5 things on it. Stick to your knitting and really communicate very well about the things that you're going to do. And by golly, they have to be transformative. When we live in a world, and lots of us have referred to this now, when you live in a world where some people have got so much money that they're just interested in sending rockets into the sky, setting up a moon base or moving to Mars, while we watch other people dying of starvation, loads of children amongst them, that is the wrong set of priorities. And that's a global change that we need to see, not just here. I don't want to see people who are wasting vast sums on ridiculous projects and still children are starving. And that, I think, is a big message that all governments should be getting behind.
Yeah. So where do we go from here then? What's the answer?
Do you want me to answer my own question?
Say something at that point.
I was waiting for the first person that hasn't answered to jump in.
I mean, Leonie, I agreed with pretty much everything you said there. I do think in terms of the global issue, one thing we have seen, and particularly since Brexit, is actually how impotent we are in global terms. And I think Keir Starmer, for all his many, many, many failings, has done a relatively good job on the global stage. He has built, obviously, you can't build, as Georgia Maloney everybody has discovered, you can't actually build a good relationship with Trump because it's not possible. He's too mentally unstable and now demented to even remember what anyone said to him 5 minutes ago. But in terms of voting for global change, well, that's sadly not on the ballot paper. And I think I'm right in saying that now 32% of the world is a democracy, whereas having gone down from 50%. So we have to recognize that the rest are autocracies and we have no power. Well, we don't have any power in any other democracies apart from ours, although we used to consider that we had some power over America, which was largely an illusion. But I think where we certainly did have power was in the EU, and this idea that there was a band of countries in the West committed to the broad ideals of liberal democracy, interpreting them in their own way. And we have thrown away that power, exactly as you say, because two charlatans, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, basically lied to the people of the UK and just made up random benefits, which of course have never materialized, and continue to assert that the wrong kind of Brexit has been delivered without ever having asserted what the right kind of Brexit might have looked at, which was incredibly convenient for them. And one of the problems facing whoever takes on the Labour mantle next, whether that's Burnham, Streeting or whatever, is this kind of Schrodinger's attitude to Europe, because whatever people think, and they were lied to, and obviously it was incredibly irritating that people then Googled what is the EU, having cast their vote in the ballot box to leave the EU. But people did. And as you said, James, it's not people's jobs to follow politics in the way that we all do. But the net result of that is that you do, whether or not you think it was a mistake, and we have some evidence to show that even people who voted for Brexit do now acknowledge it was a mistake. When you don't have very much and your earnings have not gone up since in nearly 20 years, and everything is more of a struggle than it used to be, the one thing you have left is your pride. And none of us sitting on this Zoom call or whatever it is, Riverside call, would like to acknowledge when we're wrong. I've got slightly better at it as I've got older, but none of us enjoy it. And everybody has a psychological investment in the decision they made, particularly if they hadn't voted before. So I understand that anyone wanting to be leader of the Labour Party, or any other party for that matter, the Greens can, happily dance around on their golden unicorns, because it's not, even though they've just unfortunately captured my council and are now going to unleash all kinds of mayhem, the 20-year-old student who is the deputy mayor who has never done a job in his life before, which is not ideal. We're talking Hackney. But they're never going to be running this country, or I assume not in the immediate future. So they can carry on with their fantasy politics.
Well, I'm not so sure.
Sorry?
I'm not so sure.
Well,
I think
yeah.
everything's in a state of flux. And I said half jokingly a year ago to people outside the UK that we could be looking at a situation where the next election is fought between Reform and Green. It's not impossible.
Nothing is impossible.
And
you're
you
right,
talk
Chris.
about what happened with Brexit and Farage and Boris Johnson, and how do you square the fact that the person that delivered the Brexit, which you say has been so crippling to the country, and some of us clearly agree with you, that person is the bookies' favourite and quite likely to be the next prime minister. So why would you take the snake oil from the salesman? The snake oil doesn't work, but then you tell the salesman to take over running your life.
Yeah, well, people are strange creatures. And I do think, whatever you think of Farage, and I absolutely can't stand him, he is probably the most talented communicator, and I include Boris Johnson in that this country has had in 30 years. His ability to charm, I don't even know what the analogy is, to charm snakes from the oil they slither around in or whatever, is pretty much unprecedented.
Yeah, if you look at what's just happened in the election in Scotland, it's really interesting, because Reform is clearly a union party, not a nationalist, let's be separate party. And after the referendum in Scotland in 2014, a huge swathe of working class voters who'd always previously voted Labour, that shades of what's going on with the people voting Green at the moment, all decided to vote for the SNP. Now, swathes of them are now really fed up with the SNP and are now voting unbelievably for Reform. So they've switched from voting nationalist to voting Reform, a unionist party, almost without breaking step. And if you look at the Scottish Parliament, Reform now has 17 seats, which is exactly the same as Labour on 17 seats. And the SNP's overall number of seats has come down, and their overall vote has come down a lot. And indeed, the SNP have also lost 2 seats in geographical constituencies, not on the list, to the Greens, including Nicola Sturgeon's old seat herself. So I think it's really interesting. I think the issue about communication and the way that Farage is able to communicate, and the way that Zach has led the Greens into being better communicators, I'm not saying anything they're saying is real or can be delivered. And I'd like to extend my sympathies to you, Christina. I believe this 20-year-old student is the portfolio holder for housing in Hackney. and is therefore going to be responsible for delivering services to 34,000 properties. This person cannot possibly be bringing huge life experience to this role. Zoe Garbett, until about a week and a half ago, was also a colleague on the Assembly. And I believe her priorities, as stated, are things like the Middle East, police brutality, AI, none of which are actually services that Hackney Council delivers. And I'm extremely concerned that we are going to have some problems and issues in the councils where some of the Greens have now broken through and are leading them for the reasons that I've just described. And I think, that might cause some really big issues for lots and lots of people who deserve better.
Yeah, let me ask James. I'm really interested to hear from you, James, as to how you see Labour Party's positioning with the Greens on one side and Reform on the other, and seeing the Labour Party lose voters almost, let's I don't know the actual statistics, but let's say almost in equal numbers. You're trying to keep voters in the Labour Party, and they're hemorrhaging to the left and they're hemorrhaging to the populists as well for different reasons. But what would you, if you were running the Labour Party, what would you think would be the answer to solving that particular issue?
So I wouldn't focus remotely on either Reform or the Greens or the Tories or another political party for the focus of my strategy. Normally, with politician with one colour rosette says something mean about politician with other colour rosette on, most people are not listening. And to be honest, the forces that are going to shape our lives over the coming 6-9 months do not have political parties' names on them. If you look at what is likely to come down the line, because of the the US-Israeli war on Iran, what's going to come on fuel prices, fertilizer prices, the amount of price gouging there's going to be, the government's main focus should be on how are you going to claw back the unearned profits from companies that have monopolistic or oligopolistic market positions, so in the oil and gas sector, in food and supermarkets, to protect people. The Labour Party has the privilege of being in government, and it should be looking at who are the people who are going to be ripping off and making people's lives worse in a very, very difficult period of time that we're about to experience, and how can the state be used to be on their side, which would cause an enormous break in the basic thinking that we have seen from the political media state class. So we're going to have to talk about, of course, huge windfall taxes on fossil fuel companies. We're going to have to talk about price caps so that the price for energy, for fuel, for food does not go above certain levels. We're going to have to see the taking over by the public of some industries, particularly in utilities, where people are ripped off. We will need a new way of dealing with inflation, because raising interest rates is not going to do anything about inflation when inflation is caused substantially by price gouging and by real material shortages, not by issues in the market. So things that keep down the prices of things like rent controls, like price controls, are going to have to be considered and then rapidly applied by the government. And I think if they started focusing on things like that, it's a whole different discourse. People are then not thinking about, oh, well, they're losing votes to the Greens, they're losing votes to Reform. How are they meant to manage this? Wes Streeting has said this mean thing about Andy Burnham, and Andy Burnham has said this mean thing about Keir Starmer, etc. Then you're a government that is basically doing the things which ordinary people notice. If the government came out and said, not above £1.50 at the pub, we are going to claw back that money from BP, from Shell, because their profits are now at the highest levels they've ever been. We will not allow what happened after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, where European states, including Britain, paid a huge amount, more than $1.5 trillion in extra payments in that fuel crisis. We are going to prevent that. Then I think people would take another look at Keir Starmer and the Labour government, or whoever is leading it, kind of regardless of how clumsy a communicator they were. I agree, being a good communicator is better than being a bad communicator. Totally. But honestly, Tony Blair, with the same policies that he is putting forward now, as running the state in the crisis that's going to come, wouldn't cut the mustard at all. You could have someone who was not a great Clement Attlee was not a great communicator. But if you put him in power now with the right array of forces, with these big, bold policy ideas which are on the side of the overwhelming majority of people and therefore are against some people who are, and some companies that are ripping us off, that would be quite popular.
But would the media give you an easy run if you tried to do
Never,
that?
of course not.
Consider the media are in cohorts with the people that are going to be disadvantaged by the policies that you're suggesting.
Of course.
But I think you can do it. I just want to agree with James. I want to disagree with him that it's not being done. I stood on a platform with the Mayor of London in 16, 21 and 24. And, we stood on a platform to introduce London Power, to control, prices as much, to provide a better source of energy to people in their homes. We stood on a platform of free school meals to really help families and actually, nutrition for children. What could be more important than that? We've stood on a platform where we've been calling for rent controls for a long period of time. I think there are Labour politicians who are out there who've been calling for these things, not necessarily at government level, but comes back to my, you need to make sure that you've got those 5 things in that vase that everyone is focused on, and they have to be about changing people's lives, and very much what James was saying. But I think some of us have been promoting these things, maybe not at national level, but certainly at regional level. And I think that never forget that there's more than just one level of a government. If you look at a lot of Labour councils, they've also been doing a lot of really good things as well. Sorry, I'm sure you want to bring in John as well, because he had.
Well, I do want to bring in John. I was going to ask John from his standpoint, how realistic is what James is suggesting in terms of a government being able to perform on that basis?
Well, I think it's very difficult. And I think increasingly we might make comparisons with the 1970s, actually. Remember, that was an era that was very difficult for Britain and a lot of other countries.
Mm-hmm.
It was the era of so-called stagflation, of rising inflation on the back of very similar events in the Middle East, but also rising unemployment. And one of the fears I have is that we are beginning to really see a shakeout in the tech industry around AI. So Meta and other companies are announcing job losses. Tomorrow, I think on Wednesday of this week, Meta is announcing a particularly large reduction in its workforce that's directly related to the things that AI is now doing that it didn't do previously. So I think that's a real problem. But the real elephant in the room, Chris, as ever, is Brexit. Brexit is costing Britain up to 8% of GDP every single year. And it seems to me that nobody in the Labour Party wants to really tackle this. Now, Wes Streeting came out, you may recall, a couple of days ago, and he said Brexit is a catastrophe. Burnham's people, I think, were deeply unhappy about this because facing into the Makerfield by-election next month, Brexit is being reintroduced potentially as an issue. And I think that's the one thing that he absolutely did not want in advance of what was already going to be a difficult contest there, because Reform had been doing very well in the local elections in recent times. But I genuinely think Starmer, because he is so cautious, lost a real opportunity. I think that in 2024, he should, in August or early September, gone to the people and said, this is a catastrophe. We need to look at this again. And I am proposing to hold a second referendum. I think he might even have been able to do that actually in the spring. So remember when Trump launched his war and Starmer quite rightly refused to join in, and he was then subject to all this abuse and terrible rhetoric from Trump. I think that was the point where Starmer, again, he could have made the move and said, all of this is adding to the economic harm that Brexit has done. And I think the best way out of this is to revisit this issue and hold a referendum, possibly towards the second anniversary of the Brexit vote 10 years ago. He didn't do that. Instead, he has settled for this entirely performative getting closer to the European Union. But this doesn't include coming in back into the customs union. They've also ruled out rejoining the single market. And I can tell you, as somebody who's worked on Europe for 30 years, there is no way you're going to enjoy any material benefits from what Starmer has proposed. The only thing that matters is addressing those new barriers to trade that Brexit erected after 2020. That's always the big issue. And until the Labour Party develops a spine, and even in a context where, as Christina said, the numbers are now very heavily in favour of at least thinking seriously about rejoining, then they're going to be tinkering at the margins. It won't make a difference.
Okay, I mean, I understand that, but let me make 2 points. Firstly, you can't really achieve what you want to achieve unless you accept you're going to have a return to free movement. Free movement is a very emotional issue. Although there's maybe a multitude of different reasons why someone would vote for Brexit, that was one of the major reasons. And at the time they voted to stop free movement, they thought they were stopping immigration from everywhere in the world, not just from Italy and Poland. But secondly, Brexit it's a very emotive issue. The right-wing press are controlled by people that are Brexiteers, that are pumping out Brexit propaganda the whole time. The people that support Brexit are the ones that are waving their flags. They're the ones that are really dangerous on the streets. The silent majority that maybe Remainers, they're not ones parading with their Union Jack flags. And I think there is a danger that if you try and revisit it in the way that you say, that there could really be such civil unrest, there will be blood on the streets. I really think that's an issue. But what I will say before, you can all have your say on that, is that in the Makerfield by-election, this is becoming a very, very interesting by-election. It depends who runs. But what Wes Streeting said about he would take us back into the EU, Andy Burnham is a little bit ambivalent on it. It could be a by-election. It could also almost be like an EU referendum again as to who you vote for. And because it is a reform-leaning constituency anyway, it could be make or break for Andy Burnham. It could be make or break for Keir Starmer. It could be a big statement for Wes Streeting. It could be a big statement for Nigel Farage, and it also for the country. And what we know is that the polls are showing us that in the country as a whole, there is a majority of people that would support us being part of the EU again. But I don't think that majority exists in Makerfield. And there's going to be an awful lot going on here.
Yeah. So let's just jump past the by-election for a moment and just address the two issues you raised. Firstly, free movement of Europeans was never the issue. And we saw that spectacularly after Brexit, when huge numbers of people from other parts of the world came to Britain. The small boats issue is one that is used mercilessly by the right-wing press, when actually that problem is a very, very insignificant one relative to the scale of overall inward migration to Britain. And by the way, the European Union now has a migration pact. It took almost 20 years to negotiate, but all over Europe, we are now seeing a significant reduction in migration. In Ireland, for example, we've seen a huge drop over the last year, and that parallels what's happened in Britain since 2024. The number of people actually coming into Britain has dropped by something like 68%. So that's not the issue. The issue, you rightly point out, is the way right-wing tabloids, almost all of them owned by people who do not live in Britain, are able to set the agenda and literally set people aflame. And link this to the 5 million quid gift that Farage got from a crypto billionaire based in Thailand. The problem is regulation, or the complete lack of regulation of the dark money that was hugely important in delivering Brexit, as Carol Cadwallader and so many other people have pointed us to. But it's also about the lack of regulation of the press. I mean, GB News is Pravda of our era. It just does naked propaganda on behalf of all of these rich people who don't live in the country. And it's astonishing to me that British people put up with this.
Yes, I agree. I agree with nearly all of that, John, but I don't agree that free movement wasn't the issue. If you were a white working class person in an area where there were an enormous number, but if we're going back to 15 years ago, where there were an enormous number of Polish plumbers who were undercutting you. I mean, I was picked up the other day to go to Sky News in an Uber by a guy from the DRC, and his family live in the DRC, and he shares a room with a guy, 800 quid a month. And that was the deal with people who came from the poorer EU countries. And that remains the deal with the immigrants who've come over from Nigeria or wherever, Pakistan, amongst the 1.1 million Boris wave. It's always an issue of the people who are prepared to put up with wages and living conditions that native Brits are not prepared to put up with. So I think freedom of movement was absolutely a very central part of the issue. But what I do think is that many people haven't even logged or noticed the 1.1 million who came over in the Boris wave because they were kind of sneaked into the country under urgent need for social care and all kinds of other visas. I mean, I've noticed in London now that a very high proportion of the hospitality staff everywhere Indian. Now, yeah, I couldn't care less where people come from who are serving me. I'm delighted if anyone serves me because so many people don't want to do that work. But I do wonder on what basis they came here, because whatever you call it, it's kind of skilled work, but it's not technically skilled work. So how did those people come to work as waiters on visas from India? I don't know. But I think, Chris, that you're right, that it would unleash all kinds of demons to have these discussions again. And precisely for the reasons that you've mentioned, that the people who are passionately against Brexit and passionately against small boats are passionately against whatever they're passionately against. And their passion could well be, that the passion has been a very central feature of politics in this country, really, in particular over the last decade and in the years leading up to the referendum. And it has transformed and divided our country in a deeply, deeply unpleasant way. And it's part of why we now have a Green Council in Hackney, because of the divisive politics that the Greens have capitalised on, turning Hackney into an issue of Gaza, when the last time I looked, we did not have policy over power over Netanyahu or anyone else. So I do think it's dangerous, but this is where we come back to communication, that we need people who can make that argument and explain to people the difference that it would make to have access to the economic heft that the EU offered us, but even more importantly than that, the security, because we've had the absolute luxury of living since 1945 in a country that is not at war, which Ukraine certainly hasn't had. My mother was Swedish. The Nordics have taken this incredibly seriously. Sweden has rejoined NATO. They have all kinds of policies for what happens if Russia oversteps the mark or does more of its drone incursions or whatever else it's doing in the grey zone of the war that we're currently in. So I think we really need people to make that argument. But the Labour government, the Labour majority was based on the Red Wall, partly. And if you want to make that argument, maybe you have to make new alliances and try to win over the Green voters and forget the Red Wall, because the Red Wall may not be possible for Labour. You can't straddle all the horses at once.
I agree, and the red wall may be unachievable whilst Nigel Farage is around. But Leonie, what would you like to see happen in Makerfield? Different parties would you like to see competing, and what do you think the Labour Party's stance should be on Brexit and rejoining the EU when your main competition will be Reform, which is in theory still a Brexit party?
So, I've been working in a 5-party environment in the London Assembly over the whole of the last 10 years. Originally, we had UKIP, as well as Liberal Democrats, Greens, Conservatives and Labour. And then they went away, and we've now got Reform instead, along with the Greens, Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives and Labour. So I'm very used to working in that environment. And, we have the kind of system with the top-up list and the modified D'Hondt mechanism that ensures that, if you lose out in the geographical constituencies, you probably will get some seats on the top-up list. So it always creates that kind of environment, as it does in Wales with the system there of PR, and the same in Scotland. So lots of us now have been very used to working in those environments. The first past the post system only really survives in, because we also ditched it for Europe as well. It survives in local government, which we've just seen the outcome in the recent elections on the 7th of May. And of course, it still survives in its entirety for the parliamentary elections. I think that's a separate discussion about whether or not we should be moving to a different kind of electoral system. But I would always hope that we would have maximum choice for the electorate in any by-election. Now, what we don't know from the Labour side is whether Andy Burnham, who's been given the green light by the Labour National Executive to go forward to be one of the people that local Labour members can choose as their candidate, we don't know yet if he is going to be chosen. Now,
no, but I think we can assume for the purposes of this debate that he will be.
I think it's pretty likely because he is unbelievably popular in Manchester. He also has a very high profile. I personally was quite upset that he wasn't allowed to go forward when he asked to go forward for Gorton and Denton. And I think that might go down as a very large mistake of Keir Starmer and the people on the National Executive who rejected him then. So I would hope that he would be selected by local members because I think he probably is the most high profile politician in the Northwest. And I would have thought on that basis that he might do particularly well. You know, they've obviously every media outlet in the country has been doing lots of vox pops. So despite the fact that there's a lot of people who might support Brexit and might have recently been voting for reform, people also do like to vote for popular politicians who can communicate. And I think Andy is a popular politician who is very able to communicate. He's also very experienced because he's previously been a government minister as well as having spent a long time as the mayor of Manchester. So I would give him a very good chance that he is able to win that by-election. But I think the important point that underlies all of this, and whether or not you reopen the debate on should we rejoin the EU or a Brexit stand, I don't think you could have that discussion on that debate until we address the issues that I think James first raised and we keep coming back to. And I talked about inequalities globally. We've got massive inequality in this country. And until there's a larger pie that everybody feels that they're able to get a larger slice of, until you're able to deliver that to people, people are going to argue about other people being able to come here and have that free movement because they feel that they're stealing their piece of the pie. And that is just something that, it seems to be fairly intrinsic from a small level, down a street to people arguing over parking spaces outside their house. And believe me, that is a huge debate everywhere where people have cars, up to the more sort of esoteric or existential, how does the country run itself and how should we line ourselves internationally? We need to address the fact that people are still feeling that their needs and their wishes and their wants have not been fully addressed since, I think it is right to say, since 2008, there has been stagnation and improvement in people's lives.
It keeps bringing me back to the cartoon that I'm sure we've all seen of Rupert Murdoch at the end of the table with a whole pile of cookies in front of him and a British worker on one side with one cookie and an immigrant worker on the other side with no cookies. And Rupert Murdoch saying, "Be careful, buddy, that guy wants to steal your cookie." And I think that pretty much sums it all up. But let's just have a think about Makerfield for a minute. Let's assume that Andy Burnham does run. Let's assume that the other parties field candidates like Lib Dems and Conservatives and Green as well, but that it becomes essentially a battle between Andy Burnham and the Labour Party and Reform and whoever candidate they field. This is going to have huge factors in terms of our politics, because if Andy Burnham wins and he can defeat Nigel Farage in that constituency, then he plays a very strong hand in terms of, I'm the man that can win an election for Labour against Reform. If he loses, he's not in Westminster. I don't know what it says. What does that say, John, if Andy Burnham stands there and loses?
Well, it's shaping up as a titanic battle, the by-election of by-elections, almost just short of the general election, as you say, in its significance. I noted the other day, Chris, that Caroline Lucas, I think everybody will agree, a sensible Green person, suggested that her party should not field a candidate in the by-election. And that's partly because the numbers suggest it's extremely close, I would say. Now, that will be something very interesting to watch. But I would imagine that if Burnham wins, his path to becoming Prime Minister is clear. And if he loses, Keir Starmer probably hangs on. For how long, I don't know. But that would seem to me to be the implication of this, because I don't think that Wes Streeting or anybody else has the numbers to challenge Starmer, even allowing for all the dissatisfaction and everything else that's been evident since the local elections. But I think it's likely Burnham will win.
I doubt that Wes Streeting communicates well enough anyway. That's my personal view. James, did you work with Wes Streeting and Andy Burnham, and do you have a view on their relative merits?
Wes was a backbencher the whole time I worked for the Labour Party. Andy was in the shadow cabinet for a bit, but then was the mayor of Manchester. I mean, if I had to choose between the two, I would go for Burnham every single time. Maybe 99 times out of 100, one time out of 100, I would pause for an eighth of a second and then go for Burnham. But that's more to do with it's entirely to do with their politics, not because of their communication skills. I think Wes Streeting is the best communicator on the right wing of the Labour Party, and Burnham is the best communicator sort of in the middle of the Labour Party. But as I keep on saying, let's say Burnham wins a by-election in 5 weeks' time, or however long it's going to be, as the shortages are beginning to bite, and then he becomes maybe Prime Minister, I don't know, then that you have a Labour leadership election perhaps, which maybe takes 10 weeks. So we might have a 3-month period where we're sort of having a proxy battle for who's going to lead the country. Not really in any straightforward way laying out what the agenda is going to be as the terrain is shifting dramatically, because, if you start having shortages of things which mean that your MRI machine can work, we haven't even begun to think about all of the different issues that are coming down the line. I mean, then he probably does end up as Prime Minister, but it does seem a pretty silly and undemocratic system. I mean, that's not a particular criticism of any individuals involved in it. You've got to do what you've got to do. The fact that we're going to have to change government policy quite dramatically in the coming months in one direction or another. I think it's most likely that it does not go remotely in the direction I'm laying out. It's much more likely that it's going to return to the language of tough choices, and those tough choices are always asked on the more vulnerable and for the overwhelming majority of people, and very rarely on those who are actually making a lot of money out of volatility and crisis, of which, of course, there are those people. And that change of policy won't have been decided democratically. And in part, that's because Starmer's Labour did not come up with a proper programme for government. And then there was very little scrutiny of their lack of a proper programme for government by the media in the run-up to the last election. There was a general assumption that they'll win, the grown-ups will be back in the room, everyone will breathe a sigh of relief, and it will all be fine. Again, with no engagement whatsoever with the underlying material reasons why life is difficult and therefore why politics is volatile.
Can we see a situation where if Andy Burnham does win in Makerfield, that Starmer says, okay, I see where the land lies, I'll continue for the time being, but I will not lead the party into the next election, and I will make sure there is a leadership election well ahead of the next general election, and allow Andy Burnham to take over sort of legitimately like that?
I mean, Burnham's not coming back in to sit on the back benches. If he wins, then there will be a change of leader. Of course, we don't know the exact mechanics that will happen and don't know the time frame that will happen, but I think we can be pretty clear that is what would happen. And in that, then you can look at the time frame. How long might that go on for? It does depend on what is going on in geopolitics and geoeconomics in the country at the time as well. All of these things are factors. But I think quite clearly, if Burnham wins the by-election, he's winning the by-election to be Prime Minister, and he is the most popular option with Labour members, and it's hard to see anybody else winning that internal election. I don't know if Leonie or Christina disagree, but to me, that seems quite
Well,
straightforward.
before he gets to put himself in front of Labour members, he's got to find enough backing in the Parliamentary Labour Party, who are the gatekeeper to making anything happen. And about 100 have said, we want to keep care. About 100 have said, go away. And there are about 200, I'm doing this all in round numbers, but there's, about 400 Labour members of Parliament. About 200 have said nothing and are actually pretty furious with the people who keep coming out and saying things publicly. So, neither Wes nor Andy nor Angela Rayner nor, I don't know, Uncle Tom Cobley, if he was standing as well, they actually have to find 81 people to come out publicly and say they are backing somebody who is not the Prime Minister. Now, obviously, there's about 100 MPs who are in the government, so they will, at the moment, because they are holding positions appointed by Keir, presumably they are all going to back the Prime Minister. Either they would have, or they'd have to resign. So people like James Murray, who's just agreed to replace Wes Streeting as Health Secretary, can't possibly say, "Oh, actually, I'm supporting Wes Streeting or somebody else," because he's just accepted a job from Keir. And likewise with the other sort of 3 or 4 of them that resigned. But, I don't know which direction they're going to split in. I don't know if they are going to go public. If 300 of them, let's say all the ones who are not part of the government and not PPSs, whatever number that is, all indicate privately to Keir that actually they're all completely fed up with this psychodrama, then that is about the only thing that I think would then result in him saying, actually, maybe the game is up and maybe I do need to go. And then there could potentially be a fight between Wes, Andy and Angela. I've got no idea who might put themselves forward. We're not in that place yet. We don't even know that Andy's necessarily going to win the by-election. But it is, if he wins, it is going to come down to what Labour MPs say, both publicly, but also what they say privately.
What does it say if Andy doesn't win the by-election and Reform win it?
I think it says that Labour is in very deep trouble.
Yeah.
And it would say that there needs to be some very serious thought given to how Labour plus other parties that are not anywhere near politically reform need to rethink in a first past the post system how they work together. It's interesting that Caroline Lucas has said the Greens shouldn't contest this. I suppose I always err on the side of thinking that people should have that choice. But in Gorton and Denton, it is very obvious that towards the end of the campaign, right in the last few days, lots of people have been saying to Labour, we're going to support Labour. And then they decided that voting Green was the best way to stop reform.
Yeah.
So a lot of people switched their vote and voted Green. Now, it might be that it's the reverse of that in Makerfield.
I agree.
And lots of people, Liberal Democrat and Green, decide, you know what, we're really afraid of Nigel Farage. We're all going to vote Labour.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that would happen. In which respect, it probably doesn't make an awful lot of difference if Greens do field a candidate. Could be the Tories don't field a candidate either.
I think the problem with not fielding a candidate is then it does, to a certain extent, look as though you're saying the Conservative Party is supporting reform and we're standing back to allow reform to win. And I think that's the problem with saying to the Greens, don't stand in this by-election, support Labour, and you're standing back and helping. And, and until some better discussions have taken place over, a shared platform between Liberal Democrat, Labour and Green on a long list of issues, I think that is quite difficult for parties to do that. I think informally and privately, people might decide that's what they want to do. And they might want to vote, individuals being allowed the choice to say, I'm going to vote tactically. I'm not 100% Labour, but I am 100% against reform, and give people the respect to allow them to make that choice, is my opinion.
That's likely to happen. What's best for the country, Christina, in Makerfield, in terms of who wins it?
I personally think what's best for the country is for Andy Burnham to win it and then for him to take over as Prime Minister. And I personally think that should be without a contest, that if he can beat reform, he has shown he can beat reform, because I don't think that any other candidate can beat reform at the next election. And I think we're in national emergency, and the number one priority is to keep Farage and Reform away from running our country. Because I think if they do, I mean, populism never works, and people will have some miserable years, and then they will have some choices to face. But we will go through hell, all of us as a nation, if that happens. So I'm not a big fan of Andy Burnham. My own politics are nearer to West Streetings, actually. But I think Andy Burnham is a very able politician. I think he's a grown-up. I think he's experienced in government. I think he's probably more pragmatic than many people suggest. And I think when he's faced with the bond markets and, the kind of conflicting demands of running a government as opposed to running a mayoralty, I think he probably will make some adaptations he doesn't currently want to make. So that's what I hope happens.
James, it's not your ideal scenario either, but you presumably the worst thing would be, from your standpoint, would be a Nigel Farage win in Makerfield.
Yeah, of course. And I think what Leonie was just saying about we need to think beyond just the one election and what would be a progressive way that you could keep out reform that would also be democratic. It does lie in the direction of those parties finding mechanisms that they can come together. Now that could be, I mean, if you look at other countries in the world, they have open primaries. So you might only have a Lib Dem candidate in one seat, you might only have a Green candidate in one seat, you might only have a Labour candidate in one seat, but people have had a vote for which one they want as their preferred candidate going forward for a general election. We're going to have to start to look at those types of things, I think, when politics is so fractured that it's 5 parties in England, 6 parties in Wales, 6 parties in Scotland, with an electoral system that is not built for that at all, where you're going to see parties winning on getting in the 20s of the vote. You're going to get many constituencies where you'll have 4 or 5 parties within 10% of one another. You'll end up getting this, or the side that wins will be the side that's most able to build internal alliances to move forward. And I struggle to see Labour, Andy Burnham, Jesus Christ, Tony Blair, anyone else leading them alone into the next election and defeating reform, given the likely policies they're going to bring forward and what is likely coming down the line for everyone over the next 2-3 years. So I think if you want an alternative, people are going to have to start thinking about that stuff quite quickly.
Okay, well done, everybody. Thank you very much. I think we've had a really interesting conversation. Dare I say, I think we've nailed it. I'm not sure if we have. We will know more when we get the result of the by-election and beyond. But thank you to Leonie Cooper, John O'Brennan, Christina Patterson, and James Schneider for joining me. And to all you listening, if you enjoyed the episode, please share it with your friends and family, and make sure you hit the follow button on your podcast app. The podcast is produced by Tom Platz at soundsapien.com. Thanks for listening, and catch you next time on Right on the Nail.